All right. Well, hello, Dr. Courtney Swisher Banks. How are you doing?
Hey, I am great. How are you, Maria?
I'm doing great. I'm so thankful that we have this opportunity to catch up, especially these days. We don't get to get together as
Hmm.
often or how we would like, but at
Right.
least we have these opportunities to chat. And I wanted to introduce you to the community, our followers, because with the Texas Feminist Council, we feel it's important to be able to share diverse perspectives, especially to discuss the things that the pressing issues that are impacting our communities locally.
Mhm.
And I've been blessed over the last 10 years, almost 10 years, to work with wonderful people like you. And I'll just tell people that I met Dr. Banks a few years ago through another colleague. And let me give you a little bit of background on Dr. Banks before we begin. Dr. Courtney Swisher Banks received her PhD in school psychology from Texas A&M University, specializing in prevention science. She is an assistant professor of school psychology at Sam Houston State University, a licensed psychologist, and a licensed specialist in school psychology. Dr. Banks is the director of the Creating Optimal Relationships in Educational Settings course lab and conducts research surrounding promoting home and school engagement in K through 12 schools, parent socialization of education and behavior engagement, and examining ecological factors that influence bullying participant roles. So that's an amazing background. I love what you do because what you do really kind of connects the dots in what we're looking at: communities, diversity, and just all the social issues that impact families, not just from a school perspective, but from a community perspective. And
Mhm.
I'll tell people that you have been so gracious in the past to lead presentations for our Texas Hope Consortium in Montgomery
I
County.
enjoy it. I really
Yeah,
enjoy it. Yes.
that's been
Mhm.
wonderful because all our colleagues that work in the nonprofit sector have an opportunity to hear your perspective on. We had one on implicit bias
Mhm.
a couple years
Mhm.
ago, and
Mhm.
then on serving diverse communities before that.
Mhm.
So
Right. That's right.
yeah, so it's been wonderful. And again, thank you for taking the time today.
Oh, thank you
Uh,
for having me.
yeah. So I asked Dr. Banks if she would take some time to share her perspective, her thoughts on Juneteenth, which is tomorrow. Today is the 18th, and
Mhm.
Juneteenth is, for me as a native Texan, we've always have heard about Juneteenth. I understand that
Mhm.
in other parts of the country, it may not have been that pronounced of a holiday, but it
Mhm.
has been a state holiday in Texas, I think since like the 70s. Uh,
Mhm. Mhm.
and so as a little girl, we'd always hear about it, the parades and the gatherings. But
Mhm.
it's especially poignant today because of what we're seeing nationally and in the
Mhm.
community. So I just wanted to give people an opportunity to learn more about Juneteenth and your perspectives on it. And I'll just let you go ahead and, get chatting.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you again. So, similar to what you were saying, Maria, before I kind of talk a little bit about historically Juneteenth, I remember as a kid, I'm from Austin. And so every time I heard about Juneteenth, we were going to the black parts of Austin and going and barbecuing and celebrating. And so like before I fully got just the full understanding of like really what it was and what it really meant. I just saw it as, hey, time to just get together. It's like a family reunion, obviously. So it was kind of cool. But then as I began, got older and, my parents were really trying to, sorry, that's my baby in the background. My husband has her. So I began to really look into and hear from my parents exactly what Juneteenth was. And so basically Juneteenth really is a day that is June 19th, as Maria just mentioned. It is the 19th of June. Um, June 19th, 1865 was actually the day that Union soldiers landed in Galveston, Texas, led by General Gordon. I believe that's the person who is the statue of in Galveston. General Gordon Granger where they announced that slavery was no longer, right? The abolishment of slavery, right? And so the interesting part about that, it being Juneteenth in 1865, is because it was actually June 1st, 1863, when our president at that time, Abraham Lincoln, signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which basically said, right, that slaves were to be free. They were no longer property. So the saying, of course, goes, right? The reality was it took almost 2.5 years for that message to get to Texas and to just really the South in general. As Maria mentioned, a lot of times what happens is, although this message came to Texas, this day, Juneteenth, oftentimes why it's celebrated in the South is because it marks when a lot of Confederate states got the message as well. That's no longer, right? Slaves were no longer to be property, they were to be free. And so the holiday, I looked it up again because I also forgot exactly when it became a holiday. It became a holiday in 1980, January 1st, 1980. So before that time, individuals were celebrated, but it was still, not too long ago when you think about it, right? 1980. But another piece I want to add about Juneteenth is that there's a lot of messages about and confusion and information about why maybe that information of slaves being free was suppressed. Some people say that beforehand, messengers came beforehand, but they were murdered, right? Other times, people say that maybe individuals in the South, the plantation owners, were just waiting for that last cotton harvest, right? To use the slaves for that. Others just say that, they were just, intentionally trying to hide this information so that slaves could stay on their plantation. But regardless of what the true reason was, it was Juneteenth of 1865 when we did get that message. From that point, slaves, of course, celebrated. They were able to recognize that they were no longer slaves, they were free, and they moved to freedmen's towns. And I know we talked about this last time, Tamna is actually one of freedmen's town, as well as some other areas in Houston that have historical markers about being freedmen's towns, where they literally, African Americans who were just free, established a place where they built their own community, right? Their own, land, their own shops, everything. And so as far as Juneteenth, it's important to recognize it because, of course, it speaks to the gathering together to remember the hope, self-reflection, to celebrate the pride and achievement of our ancestors.
Absolutely. And you were actually the presentation you did in Tamina for Juneteenth. Mm-hmm. That was a couple years ago with our friend Rita Wiltz in her community center. And that was a wonderful presentation.
Oh yeah, it was so fun.
Yeah, and it was especially poignant that we were able to gather in that place, in that community. So, yeah, and so knowing the history of it, and unfortunately, so much of our history does get lost, or it's not properly taught in our schools, and so it's up to families to share those stories or pass down those stories, which I don't think we do enough of, but I think, considering everything that's happening in our world today, it emphasizes the importance of having that foundation of understanding where you came from and why these things continue to come to the surface unresolved. So in that context, how do you feel that history does impact generations and influences our identity today? As far as honoring the memories and the dates and what the stories tell us.
Exactly. So it really is important to celebrate Juneteenth and other cultural traditions and just our history and our heritage in general, regardless of recognizing that, of course, there was a lot of pain, right? Even back during that time, and but it's important because it really speaks to racial identity. And this is something I also talked about before when we had the presentation together a couple of years back. So I think racial identity, before I say kind of what that is, it stems from the idea of racial socialization, which Maria, you were just talking about. Basically what that is racial socialization are the messages that typically our parents, our grandparents, our guardians give to us about both, the positive pride, achievements, where we've come from, those messages, as well as the preparation, right? Recognition that, unfortunately, in the midst of that, still now there are injustices and what you need to do and how you need to kind of carry yourself. And so what we find is that even like within the African American community, when individuals hear both that from racialization from their parents, the pride piece, as well as kind of the realities of what's going on as far as social injustices, that actually helps the African American individual, to mold their racial identity, the identity of being comfortable in their own skin, knowing who they are, in spite of maybe the messages that society may give them, negative messages or positive messages, also messages that they have after hearing, from their parents, from, maybe where they go to school, their jobs, their neighborhood, community, after hearing even those messages, how they interpret all those messages and internalize that for themselves and say, I am me because of my ancestors, right? When you have a positive racial identity, in other words, you feel good in your own skin, right? There has been research that constantly shows us that African-American students have higher achievement. They are less likely to have imposter syndrome, I shouldn't be here. I just got here because they just, it was just a fluke. They have positive well-being. And the thing about it is they have done racial socialization, racial identity, like research, just across, all ethnicities. And overwhelmingly, it's the African-American cultural group that they consistently see that, when African-Americans feel comfortable in their own skin, you have all those positive outcomes. Mm-hmm. And so that is why it's really important to really just kind of talk about your ancestors, your heritage, the hope that they had, the perseverance they had, the resiliency they had. And what's cool is that even individuals who are, of multi-races, right? Whether it's biracial or, multiracial or multi-ethnic, this racial identity, this racial socialization supports them as well, right? It's all about Maria just being comfortable in your own skin, right? Unfortunately, hearing those negative messages that society has placed on just cultures, right? Ethnicities, mm-hmm. color, your skin tone, but then knowing at the same time, you should be proud because let me tell you who your ancestors were. So that's why it's important to celebrate.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, as a Latina, for me, mm-hmm. I'm very sensitive and aware of that, mm-hmm. that with the immigrant journey. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, mm-hmm. sometimes, when people are moving between lands, the need to adapt quickly to a new society, right. The need to fit in, mm-hmm. to leave the past behind, mm-hmm. I feel hurts, mm-hmm. the growth of those people, because mm-hmm. those stories get lost and the identity right. Somehow gets a little bit lost in that journey.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it is difficult. And I think that there's those are shared journeys in our Black and Brown communities, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, we want to honor everything that our ancestors have done for us, but if mm-hmm. we're not aware and we're not engaged and keep preserving those stories and like mm-hmm. you said, understanding how it's shaping us, then there's a price to pay, right? For
exactly.
Not, yeah,
exactly.
And
that even extends, Maria, would you agree, in just the history that the schools teach, right? Like like it's it goes so much further than those messages that thankfully parents who do pass it along, but unfortunately sometimes students will go and get mixed messages at school, and then that kind of can conflict a lot of things as well, and it's because it's not the full story in our textbooks, unfortunately.
I agree. I mean, and you're younger than I am, but I know that my history lessons mm-hmm. included very little about our African American contributions in Texas. Mm-hmm. and mm-hmm. our Mexican American and Tejano roots mm-hmm. in Texas. And I really didn't begin to fully understand and grasp the deep roots and contributions of my community until I was in college, until I
Wow.
was,
Yeah.
exploring these things on my own and being challenged to think differently than what I had. You hear about the Alamo in I think
Right.
fifth or
Right.
sixth grade history, uh,
Mm-hmm.
but there's no talk about, that it was a very complex relationship between cultures at that time,
Yes.
the
Mm-hmm.
existing families here, this mix of people that came from all over that were trying to coexist and seek independence. But
Mm-hmm.
there were many, many different contributions from different ethnic populations.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so yeah, it does absolutely get lost. Now, you had when you had done a presentation with Dr. Venta uh,
Mm-hmm.
with us for our consortium a couple years ago, it was on implicit bias.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. I mean, I know that's a whole chapter, that's a whole other, course, of course we can take. But it is so relevant to what's happening
Mhm.
today with the social protesting and the unrest. Which, by the way, I do want to get a little bit of your thoughts on that, on what your personal observations are, uh,
Mhm.
because these are young generations
Mhm.
are mobilizing
Mhm.
and expressing themselves. Uh,
Mhm.
but so if you could speak a little bit about that, and then also share with us what is implicit bias? What do people, because you hear about racism, you hear about bigotry, you hear all these words, but what is implicit bias?
Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, implicit bias really stems from the foundation and knowledge that racism, discrimination is systemic. The reason why I think it's important to start and recognize that racism, social injustice, they are systemic, is because if you don't recognize that, then it's hard for one to recognize and understand what implicit bias is. Because implicit bias is basically thoughts, right? Behaviors that occur that are automatic, that oftentimes you are presented with a situation, and it's those situations where you have to quickly just make a decision, or you quickly have the quick response. And the bias is that because of the fact that our society, of course, has made race a social construct, has also continually provides injustices for people of color, honestly. um, those associations start, and we see that from as a child on. And we learn to make messages, unfortunately, make bias when we are presented with situations where we have to make quick responses. And a lot of that has to do with maybe what we were taught, these associations that we made, right? Whether we recognize we've made them or not, right? And so because of the fact that they're so quick and it's so automatic, what happens is that's what a lot of people say, and it is unconscious, right? When you're making these biased thoughts or biased behaviors, they're very unconscious. And so when you make these biased responses so quick, obviously what happens is what you were just saying, Maria, you inadvertently or unintentionally, people like to unintentionally, will engage in a prejudice type of behavior, a discriminatory type of behavior. And you can also just have errors in thinking, right? A lot of times what happens with implicit bias is those who are very intentional, right, about making sure that they say, I am not a racist, I am, I'm supportive, I'm this, may show that they have some behaviors that counter what they just said when they have to make a quick decision, right? I know Dr. Vince and I, when we presented, we talked about even like on a resume, you see a name that sounds quote unquote more ethnic versus more kind of standard. Automatic thoughts, implicit bias maybe about a name, on that resume that sounds more ethnic. We talk about, implicit bias can be in gender, right? So, the quick thought that, oh, I have to support this female, or she may need help with this. That's an implicit bias, right?
Right,
For a lot of people, unintentional, I'm just trying to help, but you didn't do that for the male, right?
right,
Or the implicit bias that, someone who has a darker skin than you, or maybe they're accent is like a non-native accent, maybe. The quick thought, right? That they may not know more than you, or they may not know anything at all, or that, they, just negative, they're unskilled. So these are what we talk about implicit biases. And again, I know that a lot of people will say that's not true. How can you control? I control everything I do, but they're so quick. That's why I keep using those words, so quick. They're so quick that, you don't realize you're doing it, right? You don't have time to think through how the professional, how the ethical, person will solve this problem. When, it's so quick.
How, because I think, and that's such an important part. And I think we are all, because we all have this. We're
Yeah, we all do. We all do. Yeah.
In every land and every culture. I mean, this is just part of the human experience. But it's also very complex, right? It's influenced by our personal experiences.
Exactly.
It's our exposure to different people, our personal relationships with different people. But I always, when I think back about our history and the civil rights movement, and I always say my generation, Generation X, we were supposed to be that fulfillment of the dream that we were born right after, 1964, and we were able to kind of reap the benefits of what so many people fought for, to be able to go to unsegregated schools. I mean, my generation was bused, so we went through all those experiences of trying to understand how do we work together, get along, coexist, live together. But frankly, there were no classes on implicit bias. There was no discussion about this.
Right.
People just had a lot of raw feelings, right? On different sides. You either agreed with it, or you kept quiet about it, or you spoke out, or I mean, you chose how you were going to try to deal with that. But I think it just kind of left all that open, like it never was resolved. It was just kind of there. We just learned to kind of, walk around it, deal with it. We went to school together, we worked together, and we started to live together. Although I will say that I don't know if you've looked at any studies recently, but I mean, I think America is much more self-segregated today. That we're choosing where to live and how to interact personally with people. Even though it's not a law that you can't get along, or you can't have friendships or personal relationships with other races, but we do that. And again, I think that goes back to that, right? That familiarity, that sense of that comfort zone.
Exactly. And the thing about it is, you made a good point, and I want to also kind of emphasize it as well, that we all, number one, we all have implicit bias, and number two, there are some things that we have implicit bias towards that is everyday things, like, right, someone made, like, Frosted Flakes versus the HEB brand of Frosted Flakes, or some people may be more biased to a particular color of car or brand, and is okay, right? It's when we are automatically having these biases that can potentially impact, right, the individual we're having it towards, negatively impact. That's when it's concerning, right? That's when we're talking about those prejudice and discrimination. And you're right. I mean, the messages we get from our communities, depending on the makeup of your communities, could also reflect, again, your implicit bias on, should you, once you move out of those communities, do you, extend your community feel with someone who's a different ethnicity, or maybe even different, ideology than you? Or no, you can't, or in your mind, no, you were taught, no, I'm not supposed to go over there. So you're exactly right. You're exactly right.
And I think that as women of color, I mean, I think that, you're, especially if you are, if you serve in positions of decision making, in your career or in your community, so a lot of times you find yourself in these situations where you may be the only person of color in the room.
Right. Exactly.
And you feel the weight of needing to be clear and be able to advocate for everyone. But it's not easy when, people kind of retreat back into the comfortable shell. And so, and then that's when I think a lot of people face those terms of being troublemakers or being, instigators, or instead
Right.
of understanding that there's not enough representation for us
Mm-hmm.
to deal with these issues of implicit bias when we're making
Exactly.
life and death decisions, or decisions that
Mm-hmm.
are going to affect the well-being of a community. Uh,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so,
You're exactly right.
it's
And
really
unfortunately, the standard um, is unfortunately a privileged standard that you're trying to work against. And so you're right. Now, all of a sudden, okay, wait a minute. You as an individual may have a thought to say, and it is a thought that you think is a very valid thought, but everyone else in the room, that's not the status quo. Like, so wait a minute, what are you doing? You're not supposed to say this. That's not the
right.
way we think. And so you're right. That's implicit bias, right? But the implicit bias is that standard, unfortunately, that we were taught. So we're
Exactly.
trying to, like you said, we're trying to disrupt that standard, especially if that standard and that association is a negative association.
Right.
You're exactly right.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's hard, and I sometimes
Yeah.
feel difficult for I think for women especially. And
Mm-hmm.
on
Mm-hmm.
top of the ethnicity, or the being the only person of color in the room,
Mm-hmm.
you're also a
Mm-hmm.
woman, and there's
Right.
all these other issues that we've been
Yep.
socialized into not speaking out or not confronting.
Exactly.
Which I'm always trying to work when I have worked with mentoring young women. Those are
Mm-hmm.
one of, for me, a big one in overcoming and using your voice, and
Mm-hmm.
in intelligent ways to defend and advocate.
You're
Um,
exactly right.
but so, Courtney, in today's climate and what we're seeing, there are a lot
Mm-hmm.
of feelings.
Mm-hmm.
People are sometimes, I suspect a lot of people are confronting this issue for the first time
Mm-hmm.
out in the open,
Mm-hmm.
and or they're being challenged for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does create difficulty, but in understanding the protests and the issues of social justice,
Mm-hmm.
um, and as we're talking about Juneteenth and the opportunity we have to revisit and rethink our history and our identity
Mm-hmm.
as a family. How do we begin to have those conversations at home with one another, either with adult children or young children,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
when there are generational differences?
Yes, yes. This is one of the questions that I will say. I constantly, like, no one is perfect in the sense of the correct answer, right? I am one that I am, a huge proponent of honesty, right? Transparency, and recognizing that it's, the discussion of why protests even have to occur, right, will spark a variety of mixed emotions, right? And that's okay. And
Mhm.
so when we talk about, just like I said, the protests with our families, regardless of the age, I do feel that it needs to be with compassion, right? Compassion, because if you're talking to maybe adult children, or maybe talking to, your brothers, sisters, parents, it may ignite maybe some feelings that they have had before with their experience with discrimination and social injustice. And so that space should be a space recognizing that it's not gonna be a kumbaya, right? It'll be a variety of emotions. And so having the compassion and empathy, right, of recognizing that, just understanding different vantage points, understanding also that how you feel, and when you come to the table to feel comfortable talking about it, you may not say a lot, or you may say a lot, but just being there, right? And being there and recognizing however the person wants to talk, understanding and feeling, kind of feeling what they feel, kind of being present with them. That's what I mean by empathy. And then, of course, I think that when we talk about it, we need to obviously surround it with hope, right? That, yes, that, the protests, the reason why we even have to have them spark a variety of mixed emotions, right? Positive, negative, anger, sadness, exhaustion. We talked about all these different emotions, but we end it as often as we can with hope, saying that it's, because we have this free speech, right? We can speak up and speak out against injustices. The purpose of a protest also is to do just that, right? To help to promote change.
Yes.
and help to, not leave off, what our ancestors fought for, right? So seeing, then bringing back those messages of the perseverance and resiliency that our ancestors did as well. And so a lot of often what I've found this time around, I'll be honest, is I'm really, everyone's saying that they feel like this time is a little bit different, right? It's like you said, it's a lot more individuals of various backgrounds who are out protesting. Even individuals, I've talked to individuals and colleagues who may initially started with, varying degrees of how much they agree or disagree. They're out, protesting, saying, what I mean? So we're seeing a lot more involvement. It's not just one isolated community group. And so speaking of, that hope and that change, and even like little things we're seeing now, just even on the news, we talk, well, we didn't talk about it, but the Rayshard Brooks, like, how quickly, the charges were brought against those cops. So I mean, just the small but even bigger changes that are occurring, that hope that protests do bring, I think that's important to incorporate into your conversation. Now, I will say, and I made a point to kind of mention this to you, Maria, that my husband and I, we had a conversation with our two older children, older, they're 8 and they're 7, kind of about current events. And what we did was we before we started talking about the current events, we talked a little historical, right? We talked about, slavery. We talked about age appropriate, right? We talked about Emancipation Proclamation. We talked about Juneteenth. We talked about all of these different things. And then we talked about how systems sometimes are in place that are unfortunate, that still bring different, African Americans down, depending on kind of where they are, related to just societal injustice, because there are some people who still don't agree with what happened like during the Civil War. And so then I sandwiched it with hope, and I was like, and I told them what happened to Mr. George Floyd. And of course, we didn't get graphic or anything. We just kind of talked about that. And then my husband and I brought up, the protests. We turned it on, seeing the show protests, right? People, of all colors, walking, holding signs. We all, Black Lives Matter. We all matter. Supporting, be respectful. So I sandwiched with hope and talked a little bit about pride and being, who you are and your ancestors. And so we thinking we did, basically what I just told you, we thinking we did an excellent job. And for about 3 days, my 8-year-old, my daughter, we had to tell her to eat. She wanted to sleep with us. She thought someone was going to come to our house because they don't like brown people and get us. And I'm like, and my husband and I were like, wait a minute. This is not what we weren't even talking about this. Our neighborhood is safe. We're good,
Right.
And so it was like, oh my gosh. And so I brought that up to say that, when you open up these conversations, I'll admit, it's uncomfortable. It may not result in immediate hope. They may, individuals, regardless of age, may not capture what you would like, which is the hope, right? That changes will happen. But they'll stay in that, especially if it's their first time hearing it, or they're seeing and really seeing what's going on, they may stay in that state of sadness, shock, maybe, upset, anger. But I think that, and she's okay now, or we're back to normal now. But I think that after you have these conversations, similar to anything you do as a parent, as a relative, you continue to model what you just talked about, right? Which is that hope. Model that it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be, but we're going to get through this together. We, number one, whatever those coping strategies, that positive coping strategy you're using, but also we, as you can see, continue to remind them, we're all going to have a better world, right? Yes. Again, you see the protests, you see this, and you begin to just allow for those conversations, should they need to be open, right?
Right.
Leave them there and continue to promote that positivity in spite of what's going on. And I think that really helped her. Yeah.
Oh, good. I mean, that's so important. I mean, hope is a spiritual virtue, right? That we have to constantly keep alive and nurturing in our homes. But yeah, you're right. I mean, we sometimes forget that there's generations, at least, someone my age, there's generations behind me that are very detached, or the
Mhm.
civil rights protests, that whole era,
Mhm.
something in a
Right.
history book that doesn't happen. And
Right.
and so to see this is
Mhm.
unnerving for some people.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and also, I think that depending on the family culture,
Mhm.
how much you communicate, how much you're able to confront in positive ways the issues that come up in your relationships.
Mhm.
I find, at least professionally and personally, that we're all over on the spectrum on that.
Mhm.
And some
Mhm.
people run from confrontation, right?
Right.
Even though it's necessary and it's healthy, they don't
Mhm.
want to have that conversation. And I
Mhm.
think that when it comes to race and social justice issues, um, I think we as a whole community sometimes do that,
Mhm.
and they are complex issues, and it's
Mhm.
hard, even for adults to really understand, like you said, the systemic racism. Uh,
Mhm.
People may be very miserable or unhappy in a workplace or in a
Mhm.
environment and not be able to actually tell you why.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
those behaviors and systems obviously do target race, but they target all kinds of other things too. Bureaucracies are
Exactly.
notorious for that.
Mhm.
And so it does take us saying, no, this is not healthy. It's not really
Mhm.
beneficial, and it's actually holding us back.
Mhm.
So, but I think that uh, hearing what you're saying and understanding, your own personal conversations with your children, um, and that's encouraging to me, because I think that that is also the type of environment we should try to nurture in the home. Uh,
Mhm.
and teach those skills, so that
Mhm.
we're able to deal with this. I mean, I know you as a mom, I as a mom want
Mhm.
my children to be able to learn from all this and
Mhm.
and grow it, right? And
Right. Right.
grow,
That's the key. Yeah, and
yeah.
grow.
And did have a few pictures I had found that I wanted to share with you. And
Mhm.
let me see.
Please, yes. As you're pulling that up, I was going to tell you. So, um, since we had that conversation, we actually drove down Monday to Galveston so that the older two could take a picture in front of the statue, the Emancipation Proclamation. Not, I'm sorry, the Juneteenth statue. So yeah, so that kind of sandwiched that hope and
That's
that
cool.
calmness and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, look at this
Yeah.
picture.
So this is in Austin in 1900, and this is one of
Wow.
the first celebrations of Juneteenth in Texas in Austin in
Man,
1900.
that is so cool.
Isn't that beautiful? I
That
just love,
is. Oh my
it's an
gosh.
amazing picture. And then let me see if I can pull another one. Um, this one would have been sharing that for the order with
Wow.
slaves,
Mhm.
getting
Mhm.
getting that order of freedom to
Mhm.
communities of slaves all around
Mhm.
Texas. And
Mhm.
like you said, it took what, 2.5 years
Right, right.
to get down here.
That is so cool.
And then I have, oh well, and I don't, this might have been the historical marker that you had. This is in Galveston, so this is
Okay. Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
by
Mhm.
Texas
Mhm.
Historical Commission, the marker celebrating, honoring Juneteenth.
Mhm.
But yeah, so I mean, I think that there's uh, so much richness in our history that to me is
Yes.
exciting to be able to revisit that and learn it through fresh
Mhm.
eyes. And
Mhm.
and anyway, Juneteenth tomorrow is very important. There is talk that they're want to make that a national holiday, which I think
Right. Yes. Yes.
absolutely.
I have. Yeah.
uh,
I agree. I agree.
because I mean, the idea, the whole ideal of freedom is
Mhm.
is is what America is based on,
Mhm.
and the fact that we haven't always lived up to it, but we're trying to get there.
Mhm.
And I think that those things definitely need to be recognized about our story. Uh,
Mhm.
and just like the protests, I'm with you 100%. Um, when for me dealing with immigrant communities, it's interesting to get their perspectives on this sometimes,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
it's in other countries you're not allowed to speak
Yeah.
your truth, and
Mhm.
that is one of the tenets of our Constitution. So protesting is exercising that right, and
Exactly. Exactly.
The more we move forward in this process of dealing with with these issues, you look back on Martin Luther King, and you look back on the maps that these amazing people have left for us. And there's a lot of wisdom there, right? In being able to kind of understand, what our goal is. But anyway, thank you so much, Dr. Courtney Swisher Banks, for your time.
Oh,
And
thank you,
all
Maria.
your,
This was great.
all your, your information, the knowledge, the wisdom. I hope it helps people to kind of begin having that conversation either at home, and then grow it to your colleagues, your friends, your circles. It's okay, right? It's okay for us to talk about these things.
Right. And I honestly have also enjoyed outside of the home, this conversation I've had with colleagues when we're at work and other organizations I'm involved in, of just, okay, well, what does this mean? Action, right? Having more action, and the action to promote meaningful change, and what that looks like, right? And making sure that it's not empty promises and empty, statements because of where we are right now, but like long term. And so I've enjoyed that as well. I don't know if the different organizations and things that you're involved in, if you have, kind of been a part of some of those conversations as well.
Yes. I mean, and that is, I think, the biggest, I mean, because breaking through the initial silence is a big step, but then we have to change. We have to make those things better for our children in the future. So, but I look forward to more chats and and more projects coming forward. Obviously, we're in the middle of a pandemic that kind of limits some of our abilities, right? But we'll figure it out. We'll get through this. So, so thank you so much, and have a wonderful Juneteenth tomorrow.
Thank you so much.
And we'll be talking to you soon.
Okay. All right. Thank you again, Maria.